I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about Australia's latest elections, we have with us Dr. Charles Edel, who is our senior advisor and Australia chair at CSIS. Charlie is coming to us directly from Sydney. Charlie, welcome. It's early where you are. Thanks for doing this.
Happy to be on, Andrew. Wanted to make sure that we saw the election and how it played out in person.
Okay, so this election was a big deal in Australia. Let's talk about why it was a big deal in Australia, but then I want to talk about why it's a big deal for the United States.
Sure. So this was the first federal election since May of 2022. The surprise here is that Labor, a center-left government, which had been in power for the first time in a decade when it won in May 2022, if we kind of reverse the clock to the way back when of January of this year, the government was in some real danger. It was losing support in the polls, the opposition was gaining an ascendancy, and people were beginning to talk about the fact that they might not win government, they might even be forced into minority government, and if they had lost altogether, they'd be the first Australian government to lose an election after its first term since 1931. So there were a lot of alarm bells here. And yet between January and now, the script totally flipped. And it looked like not only was it not a squeaker, we ended up having a landslide victory for the Labor Party. So they've just won a second term here. And the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is now in a much stronger position than he's been before, while at the same time, the opposition is really heading into the political wilderness. So you have a really new dynamic that's taking place here in Australia as it heads into the second term of the Labor government, some ways with one of the most decisive outcomes in modern Australian political history.
So Charlie, tell me about the new Prime Minister. He's the same guy as the old Prime Minister. Why is this important that he got reelected?
Andrew, I know how much you like music, so it's almost as if we were going to say, meet the new boss, same as the old boss there. So Anthony Albanese, is a labor stalwart. He's kind of been in the trenches for a very long time. He's not a flashy politician. He's not known for making long speeches. He's someone who understands the mechanics of the party, is well respected, not a radical. And one of the things that's really important to him is party discipline, party unity, and as much as is possible, civility in the political discourse. So that's the guy that we're getting in Australia again. Interestingly, though, you're going to get the same cabinet. Now, not all together, but in the key national security portfolios, the same players are going to be returned. And because of the nature of the election, because of how decisive it was, whereas they had just squeaked past the line last time and were in majority, but just by a little bit. Now, not only does the party have, I think, decisive control on the government, the opposition looks really scattered at this point, but both the party and the Prime Minister are going to feel much more confident, not only in their ability to run the government, but in policy, in personnel, in instincts, and on their ability to have the pulse of the Australian people, which is both when they want to take policy in new and creative directions, and also when they want to push back against other countries, which I'm sure we're going to start talking about.
Yeah, I want to talk about their foreign policy. What is the foreign policy agenda for Prime Minister Anthony Albanese?
In short, it's sailing that boat between the twin dangers of China and the United States at this point.
So we're a danger? Wait, stop there for a second. China, I understand being a danger to Australia, but isn't Australia our best friend?
Well, they are. And there is no moral equivalence whatsoever. And there is no equivalence in terms of the challenges posed to Australia. However, we'll talk about the US first. The imposition of the tariffs has been bewildering to Australia. The fact that the United States put tariffs on to Australia, despite the fact that Australia runs a surplus, the US has a surplus with Australia, is, in the words of the Australian Prime Minister during the election campaign, not the actions of a friendly nation, not the actions of a friend. understanding how to navigate that while, of course, staying close to the United States for security and defense purposes, while, of course, continuing to deepen commitments like defense posture, like AUKUS, but also navigating how Australia positions itself with the United States that is imposing tariffs on it, while at the same time, the public conversation in Australia looks different now than it did before. Australians, I think, are cognizant of the fact that you can, to a certain degree, separate the economic bucket from the security bucket. But if you look at polling in Australia between the end of January and May, favorability for the United States, the way that Australians assess the trustworthiness of the United States, has plummeted. We're talking something like 65% of Australians no longer feel that they can trust the United States. So, Australia and the United States allied? Do we have a long history together? Do we broadly share the same values? You betcha. But is it now a incredibly difficult policy challenge for Australia to navigate with this new U.S. administration? It's that too. So yes, the United States on the one hand. Go ahead, Andrew. Otherwise, I'm just going to start talking about...
No, good. All right. Before we get into China, so 65% of Aussies don't trust the United States. That is a shocking number. That's like saying 65% of the UK doesn't support the United States, or 65% of Canada, or 65% of Ireland. I mean, this is just New Zealand. This is just really a big number of people that don't trust the United States. Let's talk about the relationship between Prime Minister Albanese and President Trump. What is their relationship?
So they have a good relationship. And the fact that Albanese won and won decisively matters as well. We know that Trump likes winners. Not that that matters too much for Albanese, but he likes him. Now, actually, when President Trump was caught on microphone being asked about the Australian election a day or two ago, he said in the way that he says, yes, Albanese is a great guy. He's a nice guy. He's a respectful guy. I don't even know the guy who he was running against. May or may not be true. Probably is true. But subsequent to that, Andrew, the two leaders got on the phone. This is just, within the last 24 hours or so. This is in and of itself interesting because one of the critiques of the Australian government, and by Australian government, we mean the Labour Party and Anthony Albanese, because they had been the government, even if they are again, is that they didn't work hard enough to carve out an exemption for Australia to the tariffs. This was a critique at both Albanese, of Ambassador Kevin Rudd, who's in Washington. I would say an unfair critique, considering that no one in the world got an exemption at this point. And one of the critiques, the way that it landed, was, look at Albanese, he hasn't even gotten on the phone. He can't get the president on the phone. Now, again, I think that was a myopic conversation, considering no one in the world, including lands of penguins, got exemptions. Yet, nevertheless, that's how it played out. So the fact that Anthony Albanese was on the phone with the president just 24 hours ago, that they had a good conversation, that Anthony Albanese even said both, on his press release, but in the phone call, look, we had a very good conversation. I look forward to chatting with the president sometime soon. I continued to press him on whether or not Australia might get an exemption or a lowered tariff barrier. It is something in and of itself. So again, Anthony Albanese has been very careful, very measured in his words. I did talk about his phrasing, saying this was not the actions of a friend. On the other hand, they have not distanced themselves from the United States. They know how important the relationship is. They're just trying to figure out how you walk that line with a mercurial president and how you make sure that you stay in friendly relations as much as one can while still asserting your own interests.
Okay, so Albanese has some differences with Trump, but mostly sounds like they're on the same page. Are they on the same page in terms of national security?
Hold on.
They come from totally different, just let me say, of course, they come from different ends of the political spectrum, and yet you say they have a good personal relationship. On policy, are they okay? And in particular, I think in the interest of the United States, where are they on AUKUS and national security and the cooperation that we have with one of the very important Five Eyes?
Yeah, no, great question. And you caught yourself there, Andrew, because it's true, right? They're not on the same page. I mean, these are not people who are simpatico. Anthony Albanese comes from the far left of the Labour Party, even if he's not governed in that way exclusively.
That's right.
And so they're on the same wavelength that they can have a cordial phone call and, Anthony Albanese can be disciplined and it can come out okay. So I think they're okay in that regards. The places where they're not okay, and by not okay, this is not a personal thing, there are clear policy differences here, I would say are in two buckets. There's a domestic angle and there's the international and national security angle. On the domestic one, there were not more tariffs. There was not more negotiation with Australia, but there might be. There might have been and there might still be on things such as PBS, the pharmaceutical benefit scheme in Australia, that they have their medicines subsidized. The fact that there is social media regulation in Australia, which we know that both Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk have complained about. The fact that there are very stringent biosecurity kind of guidelines for how they import things. All of those are potential irritants on the relationship. And I would say for most, if not all of those, they're an absolute no-go third rail of Australian politics, particularly the benefits to pharmaceuticals. So that's where there are some policy differences there. But your question, I think, was getting us towards the national security end of things. So two areas where I'd see some slight variation. So let me be really clear. AUKUS, the Australian government is supportive of. It was a liberal initiative, that's the opposition party, the centre-right, taken on by Anthony Albanese and the Labour Party, and there is no going back to this. So they are supportive of AUKUS. The larger part, and I guess the nuanced part of this conversation is, there is a growing critique inside of Australia that the rhetoric of the government and potentially the resourcing that the government puts towards its national security portfolio, the rhetoric and the resourcing don't look the same. In fact, there's somewhat of a major difference between the two. Now, the Labour government has said it's going to gradually increase the size of its defense budget. That's going to get to 2.3% of spending against GDP within a decade. But that's a pretty slow climb. And inside of Australia, in the defense community, there's a rip-roaring debate about whether or not that's nearly enough if you both have AUKUS and you have a conventional force. And it seems that might not be able to do both. So on the one hand, there is, I think, definitely some disagreements, some divergences about the size, scale, and visibility of what Australia is spending. And in fact, we've actually heard U.S. administration officials say we should expect Australia to be spending at least 3%. That's because of the changed strategic circumstances. Point one. Point two is there is a growing conversation about whether or not AUKUS is the best pick for the Australian government, whether or not it's put too many eggs in that one basket. I do not see the Labour Party walking away in any way, shape, or form from AUKUS, but the concerns are mounting. We talked about the trustworthiness of the US and how it's perceived inside of Australia, and that is a concern in and of itself. The other one, which we might get to talk about in a second, is the very calibrated, extremely nuanced language that the Australian government uses to talk about China. Now, again, they're a sovereign nation. They'll discuss China any way they please. But it, I would say, is a divergence, clearly, with how the US administration talks about China. There are different circumstances for Australia. But if we're talking about the national security points of difference, it's clearly on defense spend. It's a little bit on how much the national security and deterrence angle are forefronted with AUKUS as his budget. And it's also about how they discuss and think about China.
Let's talk more about China. Obviously, Australia is constantly thinking about China. They're thinking about their role in the Pacific. They're thinking about the alliance with the United States. What is their level of Albanese's diplomacy with China, and what are his goals in this next administration?
Yeah, so the level of diplomacy with China is one of the accomplishments that Labour would point to for themselves. That is, when they were campaigning for the last election in the spring of 2022, they critiqued the old government on their China policy. They said it was way too loud, way too explicit, and they copped the heat for it. That slew of economic coercion, economic punishment on Australian coal, wheat, wine, rock lobsters, take your pick, across the board hit the Australians because, at least in the Labour Party's narrative, they were the leading voice, the first head over the parapet, and that was foolish, according to Labour. So, what the Labour Party has done is recalibrated and just turned the temperature down. In practice, that means that they talk about change strategic environment with the worst set of strategic circumstances since World War II. And you'll notice in the last two phrases, I did not mention China once. That's how they've conducted their foreign policy. It's not wildly divergent from oftentimes how the United States talks about it, but they have a formula that they go back to. They're very disciplined, Labour government, in their message about they'll stand up for themselves when they need to, but they want to get along as much as they can. And the way this has come out, Andrew, is they talk about their policy as one of stabilization with China. And in fact, many of the economically coercive elements of Chinese statecraft have peeled off because they've lowered the temperature. So that's how they have done it. Now, you asked what the objective was, and I think that there's actually a useful debate in Australia about this. So on the one hand, Labour would say, look, the objective is simply to lower the temperature and therefore, harden our policies maybe behind the scene, but nevertheless, it's our largest trading partner. We need to be able to sell those commodities, sell that good Australian wine up to China. That is the objective. Whereas there's a critique, I think, that many hold that stabilization in and of itself is not a policy, particularly if the fruits of stabilization are the Chinese still continuing to coerce Australia, still continuing to threaten Australia. And one of the issues that made appearance in the election but didn't quite have purchase is the Australian Navy sent a task force that circumnavigated Australia, conducted live fire drills with no pre-notification. And I think the message was pretty clear, which is this is unprecedented. You're going to see more of this. Get used to this. And by the way, we can reach out and touch you and harm you when we feel like it. So those who are critical of the Australian government would point to the fact that this is the fruit of stabilization, and it's gotten you not very much at all.
Charlie, finally, I want to ask you, commentators out there are talking about how the Australian election is similar to the Canadian election. Tell me how that is.
Similar, but not the same is, right. I think, my take on this. So look, in Canada, you had a Liberal Party that's 25 points down, no prospect, no hope of winning. I think all the analysis, which I've read, which I'm sure you've looked at, is the sledgehammer that Trump personally took against Canada, the threats of invasion, the demeaning rhetoric in terms of 51st state. Nobody likes to be punched. And as Mark Carney said, when the gloves come off, we're ready to fight. That is obviously not how things played out in Australia. Trump did not attack Australia. I think he actually probably has a pretty fond and warm feeling towards Australia. So it's not the same. However, I think one could make the case, and it's, there's no hard data behind this, that if Liberal, which is the opposition party, the coalition, had been polling near even, if not even slightly ahead at the beginning of this year in January, the fact that they lost in a landslide has something to do with the Trump effect. The fact that their leading candidate of the opposition, Peter Dutton, at first, I think, tried to make the pitch that he was very much like Trump. He wanted to have something similar to Doge in Australia. He wanted to cancel work from home. He is a cultural warrior on this, seemed to redound really against him and against the Liberal Party here. Now, we shouldn't over-egg the pudding here, or we shouldn't make the comparison too right, because the Liberals, I think it's widely acknowledged here, ran a really disastrous campaign, many own goals on this. They weren't organized. Labor was totally disciplined on this. And so it was more about domestic issues. But when a voter goes into the ballot box to cast their vote, and in Australia, it's mandatory, it's compulsory that you do this, you bring a lot of things with you when you go in to vote. And kind of feelings of unease about the state of the world, feelings of unease about trade, and actions that are not a friend, in the word of the prime minister, clearly had effect, even if it was more implicit than explicit, I think.
Charlie, this is a great primer on the election. Thank you so much for your insight as always, and good day to you.
Good day to you, Andrew. Thanks for the conversation.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.